Today I'm going to be sharing how I make my 3D prints go from looking like this to smooth and free of any visible layer lines. I'll be building the Armorer's tools today. I figured it was quite fitting for the topic of this video. First, I wanted to go over some print settings. We are going to be doing quite a bit of sanding on these parts, so you'll want to make sure that your prints have enough thickness to the walls and top and bottom surfaces. I always use at least 4 walls, 4 top surface layers, and 3 bottom surface layers on my prints. I'll increase these amounts depending on the specific part I'm printing, but this is the minimum that you're going to want to look at using so that you're never in danger of sanding right through or having any of the infill be visible. But back to my prints, the multiple Armorer tools also gives me the chance to print them in multiple types of filament to show you how I deal with the different properties each material has. We've got PLA, PETG, and ABS. The first thing we need to do once the parts have printed is remove any support material, which I have a variety of tools I like using for this. First up, gloves. Things can get pretty sharp at times when you're removing support, so it's best to protect your hands. Next, some flush cutters. These are the same kind that the majority of 3D printers come with, so you've probably already got a pair laying around. Next, some pliers. I typically keep 2 sizes on hand. These needle nose ones that have some nice gripping ridges on the inside of the points, and these tweezer pliers for smaller areas. Lastly, a deburring tool. This one specifically has a plastic cutting blade installed on it, which has a smaller end point. Now, these Armorer tools didn't have a ton of support on them, but there were a few bits here and there that did require support. So you can see here, I just use the larger needle nose pliers to pull it away. Sometimes you can do this by hand, but the pliers are a lot of the time just easier to get into the spaces. If there are some stubborn support pieces left behind or just more rough areas, I will go in with the flush cutters and trim that off. On any areas that are quite small, that's where I go in with the tweezer nose pliers. And for this group of parts, the only time I really used the deburring tool were on the ABS pieces, because I'm typically printing those with a brim just to mitigate any possible warping that might happen. ABS is a very difficult material. It likes to shrink and pull away from the bed, so putting a small brim on all of the parts just stops that. And because it's ABS, I don't even mind having the extra plastic material, because this will all end up just getting recycled into my ABS slurry. Once all of your parts have been cleaned up, it's time to move on to the real post-processing work. First off, make sure you've got a good respirator to wear. We're about to be doing a bunch of stuff that you're not going to want in your lungs. We're going to start with the PLA hammer pieces. I always like to start by filing down any super rough areas, half for my own hands' safety, but this will also make it easier to sand. And I'm sure if you've been here on this channel for a while, you'll know what's about to come next. Yes, it is the infamous foot sander. And yes, it is literally a human foot sander / callus remover. It has this adjustable speed setting. I normally run it like 1 speed down from max, but it is the GOAT of all 3D printing sanding tools, and if you don't already own one of these, what are you doing with your life? But seriously, it has become somewhat of a joke on this channel, and there has been a concerning amount of people come up to me in real life, and the first thing they start talking about is this tool, so I'm glad to know this is what my legacy on the internet is going to end up being. I'm sure a lot of you already have this, so I really don't need to get too into it, but it is just the perfect thing for sanding 3D prints of any filament type. You will see me use this consistently throughout this video. It is the only sanding tool that I will use for the initial sand, so the only time that I ever use the foot sander in my post-processing process is straight on the filament. Typically they have like 60 or 80 grit sandpaper discs, so it's quite rough, which is also why I end up doing as much sanding at the beginning, since it's so much easier to use than hand sanding everything later. So I do really try and take my time here, and you can see the before and after of what the end of this hammer looked like. And remember, this is PLA, which is like the worst filament to sand. It basically does not sand. That's how bad PLA is for sanding. So I go over as much of the parts as I can with this. Sometimes it will not fit into certain areas, which is why I also go over everything with some sandpaper. Typically I use 100 grit, sometimes it'll be 120. Of course, the sandpaper grit is a matter of personal preference and also user experience and how much pressure and force you might be getting when using sandpaper on your parts. I do go over everything with sandpaper, but especially focusing on areas where the foot sander couldn't reach. And here's what all of the parts are looking like after that initial sand. A nice, even, scratched up surface, really no layer lines visible at this point, and I decided to start putting these pieces together. Again, this is very project dependent as well as a personal preference. Typically, I wouldn't immediately start assembling parts, especially if they're easier to work on while they're separate, but for this hammer, I figured the main concern for these parts now were the seam joins. So that is why I decided to, even before any filler primer, go in with some Bondo spot and glazing putty to try to start minimizing those seam lines as fast as possible. Same with the upper part of the hammer where those more intense rough spots were. I'm sure both of these areas are going to need more work later on, but I try and be as efficient as possible, so I wanted to start filling in those spaces as soon as possible. Of course, after all of that has dried, we're back to another round of sanding. For spot putty sanding, I typically use around 180 grit. After sanding and before starting painting of any sort, I always make sure to air dust off the parts to get rid of any excess dust. And now it's on to our first round of filler primer. This is basically a super thick spray paint that's typically used for automotive repair purposes, but it's perfect for filling in any layer lines on 3D prints. I would say I apply a medium to thick coat anytime I start spraying this on pieces, and I always do 2 coats with adequate drying in between to really build up the filler primer so that I'm not sanding unnecessarily, because none of us want to have to sand any more than we already are. Here is what the hammer was looking like after the 2 rounds of filler primer. Overall, it was quite smooth. It was really just that one seam line that was still not looking great. The hammer ends were also looking really smooth, so they're probably not going to need much more work, but now is when we go in with, once again, more sanding. This is when I use either 180 grit or 220 grit, somewhere around there, depending on the pieces. Because the main body of the hammer really wasn't looking too bad, I decided to go ahead and add these side detail parts, since I wasn't worried about them possibly getting in the way if I needed to do more sanding in that area. But since everything was looking good other than that join line, we're going to go right in with my UV resin mixture. All this is some UV printer resin mixed in with fumed silica. I used to use baby powder for years. It equally works. I basically just switched because I got sick of everything smelling like baby powder. There really isn't a recipe for this. It's basically add as much fumed silica or whatever powder into your UV resin until you get the consistency that you like. The particular mixture that I'm working with here is a lot thicker than I would probably go for this type of filler work, but this is just the stuff that I had mixed up. It was actually left over from the Tauntaun. And that is the great thing about the UV resin mixture, is you can mix it up to whatever consistency that you need depending on your project. So I'm applying this in pretty thin coats localized to where that join line is, and curing it with a handheld UV light in between layers. For this particular piece, I decided to stop at about 3 or 4 layers and go in and sand that down so that the resin didn't get too thick. UV resin is really hard, like physically, so it can take a while to sand down, so just sanding it in between before things get too thick and more annoying to sand can just help you make a much smoother transition between the parts that are already smooth and the area you're trying to fix. Of course, had to sand all of that down again, and this is what that seam was looking like, which I know is really hard to see what's going on, and if I didn't already have plans to add another layer of filler primer to this entire piece, then I probably would have just added some more paint to that one section to better see if it was smooth enough or not. So yes, this was definitely the spray it now and pray that I added enough of that UV resin to fully hide that join, which thankfully I had, and here is what that hammer was looking like now after another 2 rounds of filler primer, which I could not see a single layer line on this thing, which is exactly what you want to have happen, which means we can now go to our final prep step before we can start painting this piece, which is unfortunately another round of sanding. For this I used 400 grit sandpaper, and the main purpose of this final sand is to essentially just knock off any possible overspray that might be on some of these pieces. Especially for these armor tools that need to look like they're made out of metal, you really want the finished surface to be as smooth as possible. And I would much rather do a round of proactive sanding rather than do my first layer of paint to find out that something is stuck to the surface. The last thing that I make sure to do to these pieces before actually painting them is to wipe them down with a damp cloth. I do tend to also air dust these off, but because these are presumably getting their final paint coat started, I just really want to make sure that these pieces are nice and clean. After that, your prep work is done and you can start painting your pieces in whatever way you see fit for your project. But this is of course just one way that I go about finishing my 3D prints. Let's move on to PETG and talk about some other techniques that I like to use. These PETG pieces are going to become a pair of tongs. They're mostly flat sides. One has the top surface printing lines and the bottom has the texture of the build plate, which of course both we are going to have to figure out ways to get rid of, or I guess a mask, so that eventually these pieces can look like genuine metal. As you can tell, pretty much regardless of what type of filament I'm using, I'm starting off with the foot sander. This initial prep work really just does pay off so much in the end when you spend a decent amount of time on that raw plastic sanding job. With this being PETG though, it is a lot easier to sand than PLA, so already this is a much more enjoyable experience. It's something that you can get used to. It's not like PLA is the end to use, but if you are working on something that's going to involve a lot of sanding and post-processing work, then I would highly recommend that you see if you can successfully print in PETG. It really will save you a lot of effort in the sanding area. You can see here what one round of the foot sander has done to these parts. It's absolutely crazy what this thing can achieve, especially with an easier sanding filament like a PETG. The top and bottom texture is just like fully sanded off. And yes, I still do my final round of hand sanding just to make sure I get into all of the nooks and crannies. Much like the hammer, I decided that it was probably the best course of action to glue these parts together to work on them as a single unit. I figured once again that these seams and join lines were going to be the biggest issue for me to work on, and the only way I was going to be able to deal with those is if the parts were together. Once the glue had set, we are once again going to be going in with some spot putty, but this time thinning it down with acetone so that it is a lot easier to apply. This is how I use the spot putty the majority of the time. I really only use it at full strength if I'm working on a much more deep scratch or nick or something in the surface of the piece. And even then, if it's something that is really deep or a very wide gap, I will bust out body filler, because the spot putty is really only meant for surface imperfections and scratches and not really any larger gaps or deeper imperfections. Like realistically, the seam on the hammer I probably should have used body filler on, but it was just that one small area and I knew that I could use the UV resin and make that area stronger to fill in that gap more smoothly. But just that as an example is where you probably more ideally should be using a body filler instead of spot putty. But thinning it down like this and applying it over the entire surface is basically making yourself brush on filler primer so that you're not blowing through like 10 cans of filler primer on like one small project. I use the thinned out spot putty on a lot more than just PETG, and I also use it at different points of the process. This time around, I just figured I could save myself a round of filler primer by just immediately applying the spot putty like this onto the raw plastic. But you could definitely apply this mixture on top of filler primer and like farther along in your post-processing process if you realize that your model has more surface imperfections than you maybe initially realized, and this is possibly going to be your best option for filling those in. The nice thing about this mixture is acetone evaporates really fast, so you can very easily apply like 2 or 3 thin coats of this stuff in no time at all. Like the first areas where I started applying the spot putty thinned out are pretty much dry by the time I'm finished the rest of the prop, so you can basically just cycle around on the same piece depending on the size of the part you're working on. And then we're of course back to our favorite activity, sanding. Once again, back with 180 180 grit. I personally find that anything rougher than 180 scratches up the spot putty too much. I also probably should have mentioned and included a good apron that has legs as a pretty necessary tool. I will link my favorite down below along with any of the other specific tools and materials that I use in this video if you're interested in checking something out. Once I got all of the Bondo sanded off of the 2 tong halves, I went in with my double round of filler primer. After the paint had dried, this is what the tongs were looking like. Honestly, these were looking pretty great, other than in some areas you could more visibly see those seam lines still. But I would much rather take a few areas of touch-up over having to do a whole lot more work across the entire body of the piece. But before we get started with the touch-ups, we are back to our favorite task, which this is once again using either 180 or 220 grit sandpaper. Kind of depends on how much the surface is like already perfected. So in this case, I used 220 since overall this piece was looking really smooth, just those areas that still needed a bit of work, so I didn't want to unnecessarily scratch up the surface. As I'm sure you've gathered, hand sanding is pretty much an unavoidable part of this smoothing process. And another little trick that I use all of the time, although this is like the one clip in which I don't have one on, is a compression sleeve. It seriously helps so much with arm fatigue, especially if you're prone to tendonitis or just the repetitive motion just really aggravate your joints or arm muscles or anything like that. Try compression sleeve, it helps me out so much. But thankfully this next step is a little break from sanding, at least for a little bit. Since overall these parts were looking really smooth and really only needed those touch-ups, I went in with my UV resin mixture to fill in those little areas and gaps to better make the surfaces of these tongs look like they are one solid piece. But yes, of course, unfortunately after all of this, there is more sanding involved. I did do another couple rounds of filler primer after this, which apparently I failed to film, but after that everything was looking smooth enough to start the final 400 grit sanding step, which once finished meant that I could finally paint these tongs. Now onto the ABS pieces, which for once we're actually not going to be starting with the foot sander. One of the great properties of ABS is that it can be smoothed out with acetone. In this jar I've got my ABS slurry, which is acetone with some ABS support material dissolved into it to make it a bit of a thicker consistency. This is perfect for smoothing out parts and also a great way to recycle the extra plastic. These are parts for a different set of tongs, so much like the other ones, they have quite a textured top and bottom that I've got to smooth out. The acetone basically starts to melt the surface of the ABS, which is why you see me really scrubbing at it, and then the added ABS into the acetone mixture just helps to fill in any of those gaps. I will say, as weird of a color as my acetone mixture is right now, just thanks to the various colors of extra ABS that I have melted into it, it is actually quite helpful for the acetone mixture to have a different color than the ABS you're working on, because it makes it a lot easier to see just how much of that mixture is built up onto the surface and where you've already applied it or not. If you've watched any of my build videos from the last year, then you've most likely seen me printing exclusively in ABS. That choice is pretty much entirely because of how much easier it is to post-process compared to PLA or even PETG. Obviously, the ease of smoothing with acetone and it being a waste-free process thanks to the ability of recycling the support material back into an acetone slurry is a bonus, but where ABS really stands apart is just how much easier it is to sand. Especially using our trusty old foot sander, it sands that it can be like buttery smooth just after using the foot sander, which also means it makes the post-processing process a whole lot faster compared to other filaments. Like, for instance, I could take a helmet straight off of the printer and get it ready for painting like within a day, which before I started using ABS, that would have been unheard of. It would have been like a 2 to 3 day process at least to get it paint ready. It's one of those things that I really do not know how to have this like come across on camera, like just how easy it is to smooth this stuff. I guess the one visual representation would be you can see just how much more dust is coming off from this sanding process despite me using the exact same tool as with the PLA and PETG. There's just a whole lot more of that filament dust on my apron, and that is because ABS actually does work very well with sanding. So does ASA. ASA is basically like the newer version of ABS. ABS, they're basically identical to work with. And I know this is white filament, so it's really hard to see, but this piece looks absolutely flawless after the one sand. The other reason that I really like working with ABS or ASA is because you can use that same acetone slurry mixture or just acetone on its own to chemically bond the pieces together instead of glue. So this in theory creates an even stronger bond than glue on pieces would, because you are quite literally chemically bonding and melting this plastic together. Its only downside is that it does take a bit longer to set than a lot of the epoxies and super glues would, but the strength that you get for the bond between pieces is unmatched. I spread out the excess that I've put between the seams to smooth it out on the join lines, and I also add more to the joins to hopefully completely mask these seam lines. And then of course going back with the foot sander to sand those out. So if I have done this well enough on any given day, then there will be no extra filling necessary for any of these parts. Once this sanding is done between all of the seam lines, it will hopefully come out after a round or two of filler primer absolutely flawlessly. So you can probably tell just how much I have condensed the post-processing process for ABS compared to PLA and PETG, which is again why it tends to be my choice of filament nowadays. For these tongs, I didn't quite get the seam lines as perfect as I had hoped, so I did go back in with a bit of my resin filler, which, you know, it doesn't always turn out as perfectly as you hope, and the resin filler is there to save you when it doesn't. So after finishing those touch-ups, sanding off the resin filler and doing another round of filler primer just to make sure everything looked good, these things were looking perfect. Which means we can go right in with our final 400 grit sanding and then on to painting. Once all of the paint had dried, the last step for these pieces was final assembly. It was easiest to keep them separated until this point to paint them, so glued on the ends of the hammer to the handle and added the pivot pin and rivets to the tongs, only adding glue to the ends of the pin so that the tongs would still open and close. I also designed and printed some custom display hooks in silver ABS, installed them on my wall, and here is the final Armorer tool display. I hope you found this video helpful for smoothing and finishing your 3D prints. These are just the steps that are working for me right now, but they could very well be improved on in the future. Of course, if you have any questions about something that I maybe didn't explain as well as I should, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.